Stand with me for a moment, close your eyes if you can, and ask yourself a question that has haunted every seeker since the beginning of time. Where does God live? Not in the abstract sense that we recite in classrooms and repeat in sermons, but in the raw, aching, personal sense, where, in this vast universe of galaxies and oceans and mountains, does the divine actually reside? The Sufis, those wandering lovers of God who walked through deserts with cracked feet and full hearts, answered this question in a way that shook the foundations of formal religion. They said, "He is not only in the heavens. He is not confined to the seventh sky, nor hidden behind a curtain of stars, nor locked away in some distant throne beyond human reach. He has chosen out of his infinite mercy to make his home in something so small, so fragile, so easily broken, the human heart." This is not poetry alone. This is not metaphor invented by mystics to sound beautiful. This is rooted in a sacred tradition, a hadith Qudsi, a divine saying narrated through the prophetic chain, where Allah says, "Neither my heavens nor my earth contain me, but the heart of my believing servant contains me." Sit with that sentence. The heavens, with their billions of stars, cannot contain him. The earth, with its oceans and deserts and cities of stone, cannot contain him. And yet a small chamber of flesh, beating quietly inside your chest right now as you listen to me, has the capacity to hold the infinite. Tonight I do not want to give you a lecture. I want to walk with you into that chamber. I want us to explore it together, layer by layer, the way the old Sufi masters explored it. Not with microscopes, but with tears, with discipline, with love, and with a fierce honesty about what it takes to make a heart worthy of such a guest. Let us begin with language itself, because language often hides truths that we walk past every single day. In Arabic the word for heart is qalb, but qalb does not simply mean the physical organ pumping blood through your veins. The root of the word qalba means to turn, to flip, to fluctuate, to overturn. The heart, according to this very root, is something that turns constantly, first toward light and then toward shadow, first toward truth and then toward illusion, first toward remembrance and then toward forgetfulness. This is why the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, used to make a particular supplication again and again. "O turner of hearts, make my heart firm upon your religion." He did not ask for a strong body. He did not ask for wealth or status. He asked for a heart that would stop fluctuating long enough to hold steady on the truth. Compare this to the Arabic word sadr, which refers to the chest, the outer casing, the more surface-level container of thoughts and worries and the noise of daily life. Sufi scholars have long distinguished between sadr and qalb. The chest is the outer courtyard, noisy and crowded with the traffic of the world, while the qalb is the inner sanctuary, the private chamber where, if you clear away the clutter, you can actually meet your Lord. This is the first secret the mystics understood. The heart is not just an emotional organ. It is not just where you feel love for your family or grief when you lose someone. It is a spiritual organ of perception, a subtle faculty capable of witnessing realities that the eyes and the intellect alone can never reach. There is a story that is told of Rabia al-Basri, one of the earliest and most fiercely devoted women in the history of Sufism, a former slave who was freed not by a master but, as tradition tells it, by a miraculous light that appeared above her while she prayed in the darkness of night. Rabia lived in Basra in the 8th century, and her entire life became a demonstration of a single idea, that love of God must be pursued for no reason other than love itself, not for the reward of paradise, not out of fear of hellfire, but purely because the beloved deserves to be loved. It is said that she was once seen running through the streets of Basra, carrying a torch in one hand and a bucket of water in the other. When asked what she was doing, she replied that she wanted to burn down paradise with the torch and put out the fires of hell with the water, so that people would finally stop worshipping God out of greed for reward or fear of punishment, and instead worship Him simply because He is worthy of worship. This is a woman who understood something profound about the heart, that the heart cannot truly love if it is constantly bargaining, constantly calculating gain and loss. A transactional heart is a closed heart. A heart that says, "I will obey you so that you give me paradise," is still, in some subtle way, serving itself. But a heart that says, "I love you because you are you," that heart has begun to empty itself of ego, and an empty heart, the Sufis tell us, is precisely the kind of chamber that can hold the divine presence. This brings us to one of the most enduring images in the entire Sufi tradition, the heart as a mirror. Imam Al-Ghazali, the great theologian and mystic of the 11th century whose work reshaped Islamic thought for centuries afterward, wrote extensively about this metaphor in his monumental work, the Ihya Ulum al-Din, the revival of the religious sciences. He explained that the heart, in its original primordial state, is like a polished mirror capable of reflecting divine light perfectly. But every sin, every act of heedlessness, every moment spent chasing the world instead of remembering God, leaves a small mark of rust upon that mirror. Commit enough sins, live carelessly enough, and eventually the mirror becomes so covered in rust and grime that it can no longer reflect anything at all. It becomes dark, blind, sealed. The Quran itself speaks of this condition in a striking verse. Nay, but that which they used to commit has covered their hearts with rust. A rusted heart does not mean a wicked heart in the dramatic, villainous sense we imagine in stories. It simply means a heart so covered in distraction, in the residue of small compromises and forgotten prayers and unchecked desires, that it can no longer see clearly. And here is the beautiful part of this teaching. Ghazali insists that the rust can be removed. Just as a mirror can be polished, the heart can be polished too, through dhikr, the remembrance of God, through repentance, through sincere self-examination, through the disciplined practices that the Sufi path calls tazkiyah, the purification of the self. The heart is not a fixed, unchangeable thing. It responds to effort. It responds to attention. It responds most of all to love. Now let me bring you to Konya, to the city where Jalaluddin Rumi, the great 13th century poet and mystic, spent the later years of his life pouring out verses that would eventually be gathered into the Masnavi, a work so revered in the Persian-speaking world that it is sometimes called the Quran in Persian. Rumi opens this vast work with the story of the reed flute, the ney. He describes a reed that has been cut from the reed bed, hollowed out, and turned into an instrument. And when this reed is played, it produces a haunting, mournful sound, because it is crying out for the reed bed from which it was severed. Rumi uses this image to describe the human soul itself, and by extension the human heart. We were once whole, once connected, once resting in a state of nearness to our origin, and now we find ourselves cut off, hollowed out by the trials of worldly existence, crying out through the music of our lives for a return to that original connection. Every love song, Rumi suggests, every note of longing you have ever felt, every unexplainable ache in your chest when you watch a sunset or hear a certain melody, all of it is the reed crying for the reed bed. All of it is the heart remembering, however dimly, that it once knew a nearness to God that this world cannot replicate. This is not sadness for the sake of sadness. It is a sacred homesickness, and the Sufis believe that this very ache, if channeled correctly, becomes the engine that drives a person back toward the divine chamber within. But the heart in Sufi cosmology does not stand alone. It exists within a whole architecture of subtle faculties that the tradition calls the lataif, the subtleties. Different Sufi orders map these subtleties slightly differently, but the Naqshbandi tradition, one of the most disciplined and widely practiced Sufi paths, offers a particularly clear structure. Beneath the heart lies the nafs, the lower self or ego, the seat of base desires, anger, jealousy and pride, the part of us that whispers self-justifications and craves recognition. Above and beyond the qalb lies the ruh, the spirit, a subtler and purer faculty connected more directly to the divine breath that was breathed into Adam. And beyond even the ruh lies something the mystics call the sir, the secret, an even more hidden chamber within the chamber, a point so intimate that some Sufi masters describe it as the place where the servant and the divine become, in a mystical sense, indistinguishable in witnessing, though never in essence. Some traditions go further still, speaking of the hafi, the hidden, and the akafa, the most hidden, layers upon layers of subtlety, each one requiring its own discipline, its own purification, its own patient unveiling. Why does this matter to you sitting here tonight? Because it tells us something crucial. The heart is not the final destination. The heart is the gateway. It is the hidden chamber of God, precisely because it is the threshold between the outer world of the senses and the inner world of the spirit. Purify the heart, and you gain access to deeper and deeper chambers within your own being, chambers that, according to the mystics, ultimately open onto the presence of God himself. The great Andalusian mystic Ibn Arabi, born in the 12th century in Murcia and later settling in Damascus, took this idea and expanded it into one of the most sophisticated metaphysical systems in the history of world religion. Ibn Arabi taught the concept of tajalli, divine self-disclosure, the idea that God is constantly revealing himself through the forms of creation, and that the human heart, when sufficiently purified, becomes the single most complete locus for this divine self-disclosure, more complete than the heavens, more complete than the angels, more complete than any other created thing. He referred to the perfected human being, the one who has fully realized this capacity, as al-insan al-kamil, the complete human. This is not a claim of divinity for the human being. Sufi orthodoxy is firm and clear on the absolute transcendence of God above his creation, but rather a claim about capacity, about the unique station granted to the human heart among all things in existence. Ibn Arabi wrote a famous line, often quoted and just as often misunderstood if taken out of its careful theological context, describing his own heart as capable of taking on every form: a pasture for gazelles, a monastery for monks, a temple for idols, the Kaaba for pilgrims, the tablets of the Torah, the scrolls of the Quran, because, he explained, love has become his religion, and wherever love's caravan turns, that is his path. What he is describing is not doctrinal confusion, but the vast, all-encompassing receptivity of a heart that has been so emptied of ego, so surrendered, that it can perceive the traces of the divine in every form of worship, every sincere seeking soul, every act of genuine devotion across the human family. A narrow heart sees only its own tribe reflected back at it. A heart that has become God's hidden chamber sees the fingerprints of the divine everywhere it turns. Let us travel now from Damascus to the Punjab, to the villages along the river Ravi, where, centuries later, a poet named Bulleh Shah composed verses in his native tongue that peasants and scholars alike could sing while working in the fields. Bulleh Shah lived in the 17th and 18th centuries, a time of political turbulence, and he became one of the most beloved Sufi poets of the subcontinent, precisely because he refused to separate mystical truth from the language of ordinary people. In one of his most famous kafis, he writes, in essence, "Enough now with your books and your learning, my friend. Go and learn the single alif of love." He is not condemning knowledge itself. Bulleh Shah was a deeply learned man. He is condemning a particular kind of knowledge, the kind that stays trapped in the head, accumulating facts and arguments and theological positions, while the heart remains untouched, unmoved, unpurified. He draws a sharp distinction that runs throughout the entire Sufi tradition, between ilm, formal knowledge, and marifa, direct experiential gnosis of God, the kind of knowing that cannot be taught through books, but only awakened through the heart's own purification and yearning. This is a crucial point for us tonight, in an age when we can access more information than any generation in human history with a single tap of a finger, and yet so many of us feel more spiritually starved than ever before. Bulleh Shah would look at our smartphones, our libraries, our endless scrolling through articles about meaning and purpose, and he would gently, mischievously ask, "But have you found the alif? Have you found that single starting point, that first letter, the doorway into direct experience of the divine within your own chest?" All the information in the world cannot substitute for one moment of the heart's genuine awakening. There is another figure essential to this story, a man named Junaid al-Baghdadi, who lived in the 9th century and is often called the master of the sect, the sober elder statesman of early Sufism. While some of his contemporaries, most famously Mansur al-Hallaj, pursued states of ecstatic intoxication so intense that Hallaj would eventually utter the phrase, "Ana al-Haq," I am the truth, a phrase that led to his execution on charges of blasphemy. Junaid taught a different path, one of sobriety, discipline, and careful containment of mystical experience within the bounds of the sacred law. Junaid famously said that the path back to sobriety after intoxication with divine love is a higher station than the intoxication itself, because it is one thing to be overwhelmed by the heart's opening in a fleeting moment of ecstasy, and it is another thing entirely to carry that opened heart back into the world, into your responsibilities, your relationships, your daily prayers, without losing your balance or your sanity. This teaches us something that is often missing from popular, watered-down spirituality today. The heart's awakening is not meant to be a permanent escape from ordinary life, a state you chase for the sake of the pleasant feeling it gives you. It is meant to transform how you live your ordinary life. A heart that has truly become God's hidden chamber does not float above the world in a permanent daze. It becomes more present, more responsible, more compassionate, more grounded in service to others, precisely because it has tasted something real. The Persian poet Farid ud-Din Attar, writing in the 12th century, gave us one of the most extraordinary allegories in all of mystical literature in his work Mantiq al-Tayr, the Conference of the Birds. In this long narrative poem, all the birds of the world gather together, having heard rumors of a great king called the Simurgh, who lives on the far side of the cosmic mountain Kaf. Led by the hoopoe, the wisest among them, the birds set out on a perilous journey across 7 valleys: the valley of quest, the valley of love, the valley of understanding, the valley of detachment, the valley of unity, the valley of bewilderment, and finally the valley of poverty and annihilation. Along the way, the vast majority of the birds turn back, overwhelmed by fear, by attachment to comfort, by doubt, by the sheer difficulty of the terrain. Only 30 birds survive the full journey and finally arrive at the court of the Simurgh. And here Attar delivers one of the most brilliant plays on words in the history of Persian literature. In Persian, Simurgh literally means 30 birds. When the 30 exhausted survivors finally stand before the throne of the great king they have crossed deserts and mountains to find, they discover that the Simurgh they sought is in some mysterious and mirror-like sense, themselves, their own purified reflection, gazing back at them. This allegory maps almost perfectly onto everything we have discussed tonight about the heart. The journey through the 7 valleys is the journey of purifying the qalb, stripping away the nefs's fear and attachment and desire, valley by valley, until what remains is a heart so clarified, so emptied of the false self, that it becomes a mirror in which the seeker finally glimpses the reality they had been seeking all along, not somewhere far away on a distant cosmic mountain, but within the very chamber of their own transformed heart. This idea of purification cannot remain abstract. The Sufi tradition maps it with remarkable psychological precision through what is called the stages of the nafs, drawn directly from Quranic language. The first stage is nafs al-ammara, the soul that commands to evil, the raw, untrained ego that chases pleasure, reacts with anger, and justifies every selfish impulse. Most of us, if we are honest with ourselves in the quiet of the night, recognize this voice easily. It is the one that wants the last word in an argument, that resents someone else's success, that reaches for the shortcut even when we know better. The second stage is nafs al-lawwama, the reproaching soul, the stage at which a person begins to notice their own faults, begins to feel the sting of conscience after a wrongdoing, begins that uncomfortable but essential process of self-accountability that the Sufis call muhasaba. This stage is often the most exhausting, because you are aware enough to see your flaws, but not yet strong enough to consistently overcome them. You fall, you regret, you rise, you fall again. And yet this reproaching stage is precious, because a soul that no longer reproaches itself at all has become dangerously comfortable with its own corruption. The third stage, the one that the great masters spent their whole lives striving toward, is nafs al-mutmaina, the soul at peace, the tranquil soul, mentioned in the Quran in a passage so beloved that it is often recited at Muslim funerals. O soul at peace, return to your Lord, well-pleased and well-pleasing to Him. This is the soul that has stopped fighting itself, that has aligned its desires with its higher purpose, that experiences a settled contentment even amid the trials of the world, because it has anchored itself in remembrance of God rather than in the shifting sands of worldly approval. When the heart reaches this station, it is no longer merely a battlefield between competing impulses. It becomes, in the fullest sense the mystics intended, a fit dwelling place for the divine, what the Quran elsewhere calls qalb-e salim, the sound heart, the only possession, the Quran tells us, that will be of any benefit on the day when neither wealth nor children will avail a person, except one who comes to God with a sound heart. I want to pause here and speak plainly to you, because it would be dishonest of me to make this sound like an easy, gentle process. The Sufi masters were not romantics who imagined the heart's purification as a soft, comfortable unfolding like a flower opening in the morning sun. They described it, again and again, using the language of fire. Rumi speaks of the chickpea in the pot, boiling and leaping and crying out to be let out of the flame, not realizing that the very fire it is fighting against is the thing transforming it from a hard, raw seed into something soft enough, cooked enough, to nourish others. The heart's transformation into a hidden chamber worthy of the divine presence requires this same fire, the fire of self-discipline, the fire of facing your own hypocrisies honestly, the fire of letting go of grudges you have nursed for years, the fire of forgiving people who never apologized, the fire of waking for the pre-dawn prayer when every part of your body begs to stay under the blanket, the fire of choosing patience when your ego demands an outburst. This is why the practice of dhikr, the remembrance of God through repeated phrases like Subhanallah, Alhamdulillah, Allahu Akbar, or the single word Allah itself, is not treated in the Sufi tradition as a magical incantation, but as a disciplined, repeated act of turning the heart, again and again, away from its own noise and back toward its true center. Just as a muscle strengthens through repeated exercise, the heart's capacity to remain oriented toward God strengthens through repeated remembrance. The Quran itself makes an extraordinary promise about this practice. Verily, in the remembrance of God, do hearts find rest, not excitement, not entertainment. Rest, the deep settled rest of a heart that has stopped scattering itself across 1,000 worldly anxieties and has finally come home to its true occupation. There is also, within the Naqshbandi order specifically, a beautiful and paradoxical teaching known as Khalwat Dar Anjuman, solitude within the crowd. This principle teaches that the highest spiritual attainment is not necessarily found by fleeing to a cave in the mountains and cutting yourself off from society, though such retreats have their place and their value in the tradition. Rather, the highest attainment is to move through the marketplace, to sit among your family, to work your job, to navigate the noise and demands of ordinary human life, while your heart remains inwardly turned toward God, hidden from the crowd around you the way a chamber is hidden within a house. Your hands are busy with your work, your heart is busy with your Lord. This teaching feels almost designed for us today, doesn't it? We live in an age that makes constant retreat to a mountain cave nearly impossible for most people. We have families to feed, jobs to attend, cities full of noise and screens and demands on our attention every single second. The Naqshbandi masters, centuries before smartphones existed, seemed to anticipate exactly this condition and offered a solution. You do not need to escape the crowd to reach the chamber of the heart. You need only learn to carry a hidden solitude within you, even while standing shoulder to shoulder with 1,000 other people. This is achieved through the practice the tradition calls muraqabah, spiritual vigilance or meditative watchfulness, in which the seeker trains themselves to maintain an inner awareness of being watched by and connected to the divine, even in the middle of the most mundane tasks, washing dishes, sitting in traffic, waiting in a line at the market. The chamber does not close simply because the outer world grows loud. It closes only when we forget it exists. Let me tell you now of a moment recorded from the life of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, that Sufi commentators have returned to again and again when speaking of the heart's capacity. During the miraculous night journey known as the Isra and Miraj, in which the Prophet was taken from Mecca to Jerusalem and then ascended through the heavens, he passed beyond Gabriel himself, beyond the Lote tree at the furthest boundary that even the greatest of angels could not cross, into a proximity to the divine that defies ordinary description. And yet the tradition tells us this was not an ascension of his body traveling through physical space alone in the way we imagine a rocket traveling to the moon. The mystics understood it as, at its deepest level, a journey of the heart, an unveiling of what the heart is truly capable of, when it has been polished to its utmost degree, when it belongs entirely to God, when nothing of the ego remains to obstruct the view. If the heart of the most perfected human being in history could carry him to a nearness beyond the comprehension of angels, then what does this tell us about the potential dormant in our own hearts, however dusty, however neglected, however rusted they may currently be? It tells us that the chamber is real. It tells us that the capacity is real. It tells us that the only question remaining is whether we are willing to do the work of clearing it out. I think of the story of Bayazid Bistami, the 9th century Persian mystic famous for his startling ecstatic utterances, who reportedly said that for 30 years he sought God, but when he reached him, he found that he had been the veil over his own eyes all along, and that the moment his own selfhood dissolved, the sought and the seeker collapsed into one continuous act of seeking without a separate seeker left to claim it. This teaching of fana, annihilation of the ego self, followed by baqa, subsistence or abiding in God, forms one of the central movements of Sufi metaphysics. It does not mean, as some critics have mistakenly assumed, that the human being literally becomes God or merges into God's essence. Orthodox Sufism has always guarded fiercely against this misunderstanding, insisting on the eternal, unbridgeable distinction between creator and created. What it means, rather, is that the illusion of a separate, self-sufficient ego, the nefs's false claim to autonomous existence apart from its sustainer, dissolves, revealing what was always true, that we exist only through God's continuous sustaining, that our very breath is borrowed, that the heart beating in your chest right now is not something you manufactured or earned, but something given to you, moment by moment, by the same source that hides himself within it. When the false self dissolves, what remains standing, what abides, is a heart cleared of its own noisy claims to independence, finally able to reflect its sustainer the way a still lake reflects the moon, not because the lake has become the moon, but because it has become still and clear enough to receive its light without distortion. I want to bring this closer to you now, because I do not want you to leave this gathering tonight thinking that any of this belongs only to medieval poets and long-dead saints in far-off deserts and mountains. This chamber I have been describing beats inside your own chest right now, at this very moment, whether you are 20 years old or 80, whether you have prayed every single day of your life or have not prayed in years, whether you feel close to God tonight, or feel as so many of us secretly feel, distant, dry, disconnected, unsure if anyone is even listening. The Sufi masters would tell you that this very feeling of distance, this very ache of disconnection, is itself a sign of life in the heart. A heart that has gone completely dead does not ache for God. It does not even notice his absence, because it has stopped believing there was ever anything to be absent from. If you feel the ache tonight, if some quiet, exhausted part of you recognized something true in these words, that is the reed crying for the reed bed. That is the mirror, even beneath its rust, sensing that it was made to reflect light. That is the hidden chamber, however locked and dusty it may currently be, still standing, still structurally intact, still waiting. So what practically do we do with this? The Sufi path never left this question unanswered in vague spiritual platitudes. It offered concrete disciplines, tested across more than 1,000 years of practitioners. It begins with muhasaba, the honest accounting of the self, taking a few quiet minutes at the end of each day to ask, without harsh self-punishment but with clear-eyed honesty, where did my heart turn today, and where did it turn away? It continues with regular, sincere repentance, tawbah, not as a single dramatic event, but as a daily returning, a daily wiping of the mirror before the dust accumulates too thickly to remove. It continues with dhikr, the disciplined, repeated remembrance of God's names and attributes, whether in the stillness of the night or in the spare moments between the tasks of an ordinary day. It continues with sohbet, companionship with those whose own hearts are further along the path than yours, because the state of a person's heart is contagious in ways that words alone cannot achieve. Sitting near someone whose heart has been polished tends, slowly and almost imperceptibly, to polish your own. It continues with service to others, because the Sufis consistently taught that a heart turned only inward, obsessed with its own spiritual states and experiences, has missed the point. The heart that has truly become God's chamber overflows outward in compassion, in generosity, in genuine concern for the suffering of others, because it has begun to see the same divine trace in every human face that it has begun to sense within its own chest. And it continues, perhaps most simply and most difficult of all, with sincerity, ikhlas, the quiet, unglamorous commitment to do the right thing even when no one is watching, even when there is no applause, even when the ego receives absolutely nothing in return except the knowledge that the mirror grew a little clearer today than it was yesterday. There is a physical, historical episode from the life of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, that the scholars of Sufism have treated as the founding proof text for everything I have been describing tonight, and I would be doing this subject a disservice if I did not mention it directly. When he was still a young boy being raised among the Bani Sa'ad tribe in the desert, tradition records that the angel Gabriel appeared, opened his chest, removed his heart, washed it in a golden basin filled with the waters of Zamzam, and then extracted from it what is described as a small black clot, sometimes rendered as the portion of Satan, before returning the heart, now cleansed, to its place. This event, known as Sharh al-Sadr, the opening or expansion of the chest, is recorded in the most trusted collections of prophetic narration, and it happened again, in an even more expanded form, on the night of his ascension through the heavens. Sufi commentators have always understood this narrative as more than a singular biographical miracle, reserved for a single individual. They read it as a template, a demonstration of what purification actually requires. Notice what the story does not say. It does not say that Gabriel handed the young boy a book to memorize, or a set of rules to follow, or a lecture to absorb. The purification happened directly to the heart itself, physically, deliberately, with something extracted and something washed clean. The lesson embedded here is that spiritual transformation is not primarily an intellectual project. You cannot read your way into a purified heart the way you might read your way into a university degree. Something has to be removed, something has to be washed. This is precisely why the Quran itself opens its description of true faith not with a checklist of correct beliefs alone, but with an emphasis on the condition of the chest, repeatedly asking whether God has expanded a person's chest to Islam, using this same root, sadr, that appears in the story of the Prophet's own purification. This distinction between the heart and the intellect deserves a few more moments of our attention, because it is often the single most misunderstood aspect of the entire Sufi project, especially among people encountering it for the first time from a modern, rationalist background. The Sufis never taught that the intellect, the aqli, was worthless or an enemy to be discarded. Some of the greatest intellects in Islamic history, Al-Ghazali himself, who mastered philosophy, logic and law before ever turning fully to the mystical path, were formidable rational thinkers. What the Sufi masters insisted upon, however, was a matter of hierarchy and jurisdiction. The intellect is a brilliant servant but a poor master. It can analyze, categorize, argue and defend, but it cannot on its own taste. There is a well-known distinction in the tradition between ilm al-yaqeen, knowledge of certainty, which is the kind of knowing you gain by being told something reliable or reasoning your way to a conclusion, and haqq al-yaqin, the truth of certainty, which is the kind of knowing that comes only through direct tasting. The way you know the sweetness of honey not because someone described it to you accurately, but because you have placed it on your own tongue. The intellect can describe the sweetness of nearness to God with remarkable precision, drawing on theology, philosophy and scripture. But only the heart can taste that nearness directly. This is why the great Persian saint Data Ganj Bakh, known formally as Ali Hujwari, whose shrine still draws pilgrims by the thousands in Lahore to this day, wrote in his celebrated treatise Kashf al-Mahjub, The Unveiling of the Veiled, that knowledge without the accompanying state of the heart is like a lamp without oil. It may look like a source of light from a distance, but it has nothing left to burn. I want to speak now about a pairing of states that every serious traveler on this path eventually encounters and must learn to navigate with patience: qabd and bast, contraction and expansion. The Sufi masters observed, with the precision of physicians studying a recurring symptom, that the heart does not remain in one fixed condition permanently, even after significant progress on the path. There are days, sometimes entire seasons of life, when the heart feels expanded, vast, light, joyful, brimming with an almost effortless sweetness in worship and remembrance, when prayer feels less like a duty and more like a reunion. And there are other days, equally real and equally important, when the heart contracts, qabd, when worship feels dry, when the same words of remembrance that once brought tears now feel like empty repetition, when a heaviness settles over the chest for reasons that cannot always be traced to any specific sin or failure. The great error that many sincere seekers make is assuming that contraction always signals spiritual failure or divine displeasure, and that only expansion signals divine favor. The masters taught something far more nuanced and I think far more compassionate. Both states are gifts, and both states are tests, but they test different things. Expansion tests whether you will remain humble and grateful rather than boastful when the sweetness comes easily. Contraction tests whether you will remain faithful and persistent even when the sweetness disappears entirely, whether your devotion was ever really about the sweetness at all, or whether it was about the one who is equally present, equally near, equally deserving of your remembrance, whether you feel him or not on any given day. A servant who only remembers God when it feels good has not yet built a true relationship. A servant who continues to knock on the door, even during the driest, most contracted seasons of the heart, has begun to build something that will outlast every fleeting emotional state. Hazrat Ali ibn Abi Talib, the Prophet's cousin and son-in-law, whose sayings form a cornerstone of Sufi ethical teaching across nearly every order and lineage, is reported to have said that the heart of the believer is like an overturned vessel, until it becomes, through discipline and remembrance, an upright one capable of receiving and retaining wisdom without it spilling straight back out. He also famously described 4 types of hearts, in a manner that Sufi commentators have returned to repeatedly across the centuries. A heart in which faith burns like a lamp giving light. A heart sealed shut in blackness, having rejected truth so persistently that it can no longer receive it. A heart in which 2 competing forces, faith and hypocrisy, wage a constant war, tilting first one way and then the other depending on which force feeds it more in a given moment. And a heart that stands empty, devoid of either genuine faith or genuine denial, adrift, unanchored, waiting to be claimed by whichever influence reaches it first, like a stalk of grass in an open field bending helplessly, with whichever direction the wind happens to blow that day. Which of these 4 hearts do you carry tonight? This is not a question meant to shame you, but to locate you, because the entire Sufi path begins with an honest diagnosis before any treatment can be prescribed. A physician who does not correctly identify the illness cannot possibly prescribe the correct medicine, and the heart's diseases, the tradition insists, are every bit as real, every bit as in need of careful diagnosis, as any disease of the body: envy, arrogance, love of praise, attachment to wealth, harboring resentment, each one a distinct ailment with its own distinct remedy, discussed at great length in works like Ghazali's chapters on the destructive matters of the heart. There is also a beautiful teaching embedded in the concept of ihsan, a word that appears in one of the most cited traditions in the entire corpus of prophetic sayings, the Hadith of Jibril, in which the angel Gabriel, appearing in human form, asked the Prophet a series of questions in front of his companions to teach them the structure of their own religion. When asked to define ihsan, the highest of the 3 dimensions of faith after Islam and Iman, the Prophet answered, "It is that you worship God as though you see him, and if you do not see him, then indeed he sees you." Notice the architecture of this single sentence. It does not ask you to worship God as though you have proven a philosophical argument about his existence. It asks you to worship as though you see him, an entirely different register of engagement, immediate, personal, unmediated by argument. This is the heart's mode of knowing rather than the intellect's mode of knowing. And the Sufis have always regarded Ihsan as the very station toward which the entire discipline of purifying the heart aims. A person who has attained even a taste of Ihsan no longer needs external threats of punishment or external promises of reward to behave with integrity, because they have begun to sense, in the quiet chamber of their own chest, a witness who requires no threats or bribes to be taken seriously. This is, incidentally, the deepest and most practical answer to a question people often ask when they encounter this tradition for the first time. What is the actual, tangible benefit of doing all this inner work, the dhikr, the self-examination, the disciplined struggle against the nafs? The answer is not merely a future reward in some distant afterlife, though the tradition certainly affirms that. The answer is a transformed relationship with the present moment itself, what the Sufis call waqat, the moment, the simple but radical teaching that the sincere seeker learns to be fully present with God right now, in this very instant, rather than perpetually anxious about a past that cannot be changed, or a future that has not yet arrived. A heart anchored in waqat does not waste its limited store of attention relitigating yesterday's mistakes or catastrophizing about tomorrow's uncertainties. It meets this moment, this breath, this very sentence you are hearing right now, as the only moment in which the divine chamber can actually be accessed, because the past no longer exists to enter, and the future has not yet arrived to be entered. I would be leaving out something essential if I did not also tell you about the friendship between Rumi and Shams of Tabriz, because it illustrates something about the heart's awakening that no amount of solitary study can replicate. Rumi, before he met Shams, was already a respected, learned religious scholar in Konya, a professor with students, a man whose life followed the orderly rhythms of formal jurisprudence and theology. When the wandering, unconventional dervish Shams arrived in the city and the two men met, tradition tells us that something in Rumi's heart cracked open in a way that decades of formal study never had. Their relationship was intense, transformative, and controversial enough among Rumi's own students that Shams eventually disappeared, likely killed by those jealous of the attention his master now gave this itinerant stranger over his own disciples. And it was out of the devastation of that loss, out of the raw grief of separation from the one companion who had unlocked something in his heart that books alone never could, that Rumi began pouring out the poetry that would make him, centuries later, one of the most widely read poets on earth. What does this teach us? It teaches us that the heart's awakening is very rarely a purely private, solitary achievement. It is almost always catalyzed by encounter, by a teacher, a companion, a moment of unexpected connection with another soul whose own heart has already begun to burn, and whose nearness sets something alight in yours. This is precisely why the Sufi path has always placed such enormous emphasis on sohbet, sacred companionship, and on the relationship between a seeker and a guide, a murshid. It is exceedingly difficult, though perhaps not entirely impossible, to polish your own mirror in complete isolation, staring only at your own reflection. Sometimes you need to stand near someone whose mirror is already clean enough that its light spills over and begins, almost without your noticing, to clean your own. Let me also speak briefly of the concept of Tawheed as Junaid al-Baghdadi and later masters understood it, because it deepens everything we have discussed about the heart's ultimate purpose. Tawheed is usually translated simply as the oneness of God, and at the level of basic theology, this is entirely correct, the affirmation that there is no God but God, that he has no partners, no equals, no rivals. But the Sufi masters explored a second, deeper dimension of Tawheed that operates not at the level of theological statement, but at the level of the heart's actual lived experience. This deeper Tawheed asks, does your heart in practice actually treat God as singularly worthy of its devotion, or does it in quiet, unacknowledged ways divide its allegiance among a dozen smaller idols, the idol of reputation, the idol of financial security, the idol of a particular person's approval, the idol of comfort, the idol of being right in every argument? A person can recite the declaration of God's oneness perfectly, with flawless Arabic pronunciation, while their actual heart remains crowded with these smaller, unacknowledged deities competing for its attention and obedience. The purification of the heart, in this light, is really nothing other than the slow, patient process of dethroning these smaller idols one at a time, until the chamber is finally cleared enough to hold only the one it was originally built for. This is, perhaps, the single most practical test any of us can apply to our own hearts tonight, more useful than any elaborate spiritual vocabulary. When something is taken from me, when praise is withheld from me, when comfort is stripped away from me, does my heart still find its footing, still find its peace, in remembrance of God, or does it collapse entirely, revealing that the true object of its devotion was never God at all, but the very thing that was just taken away? There is a story Rumi tells in the Masnavi about Moses and a shepherd that I think belongs at the very center of tonight's gathering, because it corrects a mistake that even sincere, devoted people fall into again and again. Moses, walking through the wilderness, overhears a humble shepherd praying to God in the most unschooled, informal language imaginable, offering to mend God's sandals, to comb his hair, to bring him milk, speaking to the divine the way you might speak to a beloved friend or a cherished child, with no theological polish whatsoever. Moses, horrified by what strikes him as blasphemous familiarity, rebukes the shepherd harshly, telling him that God has no body, no feet needing sandals, no hair needing combing, and that such crude language is an insult to the majesty of the divine. The shepherd, devastated and ashamed, falls silent and wanders off into the desert, his connection to God apparently severed. And then something remarkable happens. God speaks directly to Moses, rebuking him in turn, telling him that he has driven away one of God's own beloved servants. I do not look at the words, God tells Moses. I look at the heart that speaks them. What seems like blasphemy to your grammar was a burning offering to me. Moses, chastened, races into the desert to find the shepherd and correct his error, only to discover that the shepherd's grief and yearning have already carried him to a station of nearness that Moses, with all his eloquence and his tablets of the law, had to strain to comprehend. This story is not, of course, an argument against learning correct theology or correct ritual practice, both of which Rumi elsewhere honors and upholds. It is a warning against a very specific and very common mistake, mistaking the outer form of devotion for the substance of devotion itself, and judging the sincerity of another heart, or even your own heart, purely by the elegance of its vocabulary, rather than the depth of its yearning. The Sufi masters called this quality of the heart, this capacity to feel true, humble yearning even when the words come out clumsy and unpolished, one of the surest signs that the chamber has actually been reached, because eloquence can be performed for an audience, but the raw ache of a shepherd talking to sandals he wishes he could mend cannot be faked. Sadi Shirazi, the 13th century Persian poet, whose works Bustan and Gulistan have been recited in homes and schools across the Persian and Urdu-speaking world for over 700 years, offers us another crucial dimension of this teaching. Adab, the refined inner and outer etiquette that must accompany the heart's approach to God and to God's creation alike. Adab is often mistranslated simply as manners or politeness, but in the Sufi vocabulary it carries a much weightier meaning, a disciplined reverence, an awareness of one's proper place before something greater than oneself, whether that something is God directly or another human being deserving of respect and kindness. Sadi taught, through story after story of kings and dervishes, merchants and beggars, that the true nobility of the heart reveals itself not in grand mystical claims or dramatic spiritual experiences, but in the smallest, most ordinary moments of how a person treats those who can do nothing for them in return. The stranger on the road, the servant in the household, the enemy who has been defeated and now lies at your mercy. This matters immensely for tonight's subject, because it guards us against a subtle danger that has quietly corrupted spiritual seekers throughout history. The danger of becoming so absorbed in cultivating one's own inner chamber, one's own mystical states, one's own private relationship with the divine, that one grows careless, even cruel, in relationships with other people. A heart that has genuinely become God's hidden chamber cannot, by the very logic of the tradition, remain indifferent to the suffering of others, because the same divine trace the mystic senses within their own chest is understood to leave its trace within every other human chest as well. Sadi's most famous verses on this subject describe the whole human race as limbs of a single body, formed from the same essence, such that when one limb suffers, no other limb can remain at rest, and a person who feels no disturbance at another's pain does not deserve, he insists bluntly, to be called human at all, let alone to claim any station of nearness to God. I think too of the humility embedded in how the great masters spoke about their own progress on this path, because it protects us from perhaps the most dangerous trap awaiting anyone who takes these teachings seriously: spiritual pride, the quiet, insidious belief that one has arrived, that one's own heart has now become sufficiently polished, sufficiently expanded, sufficiently pure, while others remain trapped in their rust and their contraction. Junaid al-Baghdadi, despite being recognized in his own lifetime as one of the towering figures of the entire tradition, is reported to have wept on his deathbed, and when asked why a man of his station would weep at such a moment, he replied that he did not know whether the angels recording his deeds, or the covenant he had made with his Lord, would be found sufficient, and that a lifetime of prayer and remembrance felt, in that final hour, like the very beginning rather than any kind of completed achievement. This is not false modesty performed for an audience. It is the authentic posture of a heart that has understood something essential about its own condition. That qalb, remember, comes from the root meaning to turn, and a heart that believes it has finally stopped turning, finally arrived at a fixed, unassailable state of purity beyond any further need for vigilance, has very often, the masters warn, just been claimed by its most subtle and dangerous form of rust. The arrogance of imagining the mirror is finished being polished. The work, they insist unanimously across every century and every language of this tradition, does not conclude until the very last breath leaves the body. There is no diploma awarded for the purified heart, no graduation ceremony after which vigilance can be relaxed. Every single day, the chamber must be swept again, the mirror wiped again, the reed's cry renewed again, because the world does not stop depositing its dust, simply because you managed to clear some of it away yesterday. Because I want its full weight to settle in your chest before you leave here tonight. Neither my heavens nor my earth contain me, but the heart of my believing servant contains me. Think about what an extraordinary act of divine humility and love this represents. The creator of galaxies too vast for our instruments to fully measure, the sustainer of oceans and mountains, and the intricate architecture of every living cell, has chosen not to make his primary dwelling in any of these grand cosmic structures, but in something as small, as vulnerable, as easily wounded as a human heart. This is not because God needs a dwelling place, for he is beyond need, beyond containment, beyond every limitation we could possibly imagine. It is because love, real love, does not seek out the grandest palace, it seeks out the most intimate chamber. A father does not feel closest to his child while standing in a vast stadium. He feels closest in the quiet, unremarkable moment of holding that child's small hand. God, in a manner infinitely beyond our full comprehension yet gestured toward again and again by every Sufi master across every century and every language, has chosen the intimate chamber of the heart over the vast stadium of the heavens, because that is where nearness, real nearness, is felt most completely. So tonight, as you walk out of this place, and back into your ordinary lives, back into your traffic and your emails, and your arguments, and your responsibilities, I ask you to carry one single thought with you, small enough to fit in your pocket, but vast enough to reshape how you understand your own existence. Somewhere beneath your ribs, in the quiet chamber that has been beating faithfully since before you could even form a single memory, there is a room that was built to hold the infinite. It may be dusty tonight, it may be cluttered with old resentments, old fears, old distractions you have not yet had the courage to clear away, but it has not been destroyed, and it has not been abandoned. It is waiting the way a locked room in an old house waits for someone to finally turn the key, open the door, and let the light back in. The rust can be polished, the reed can find its way back to the reed bed, the bird can cross the 7 valleys, the mirror can be cleared. This is not a promise reserved for saints in ancient books, it is a promise embedded in the very structure of your own being, offered to you tonight in this very moment, if only you are willing to begin the work of turning your heart, gently and patiently and honestly, back toward the one who has been hidden within it all along, waiting, as he has always been waiting, for you to come home.